The growing proletarianization of modern man and the increasing formation of masses are two aspects of the same process. Fascism attempts to organize the newly created proletarian masses without affecting the property structure which the masses strive to eliminate. Fascism sees its salvation in giving these masses not their right, but instead a chance to express themselves. The masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to give them an expression while preserving property. The logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life. The violation of the masses, whom fascism with its Führer cult forces to their knees, has its counterpart in the violation of an apparatus which is pressed into the production of ritual values. All efforts to render politics aesthetic culminate in one thing: war. A specter is haunting online gaming discourse, a specter of political radicalism. Notions of radicalism are themselves anathema to the range of acceptable political discourse as it follows from the materialities of social human life. Radicalism has too often become the watchword of those depoliticized reactions to political quote-unquote extremes. Implicitly, the greater a deviation from the status quo, and the harsher the process of change, the more extreme it is. If an occurrence should posit the same loss or gain as that of yesterday, and so many days before, no matter the human cost, then all the moonlight thinkers will draw on the well of their philosophical knowledge to reassure us it has always been this way. Unless their intuition should permit deviation, then they reassure us just as easily, no, that is too extreme. The conditions of how we live dictate what exactly we are able to know using our intuition. Intuition is the product of individual epistemic circumstance. To be a thing in particular is not to know a thing in general. However, when our epistemes reassure us of their natural quality, it is for the domestication of our political thought. Similarly, common sense aphorisms are themselves the domestication of the philosophical impulse. Because the range of acceptable discourse is in part based on those ideas and beliefs which are socially acceptable, this is also a function of what the psychologists call sublimation in the Freudian sense. The seeker is the id impulse, one who wishes to know, and also one who wishes to be free in the sense that to seek is to venture outward. Because knowledge from a human biological perspective serves the function of survival, the limitations of life or the finite is the ego impulse, channeling the seeker like water. To dam that flow is the mask, as the moral superego, enforcing society's implicit horizon as unspoken norm. One who is unable to ask is unable to know. One who is unable to know is unable to ask. As with the Chinese finger trap, the mind pulls at both ends and cannot escape. Not only a pull but also a push is required. The trap is also a game. To play means freedom. In the old days, there were previous series of first-person shooters like Doom and Wolfenstein, which helped serve as a template for future games, both in their own series and in the industry broadly. The original Castle Wolfenstein was a third-person game for the Apple II, but got ports for the Atari, the Commodore 64, and MS-DOS. The game is heralded as not only one of the earlier templates for shooter games, but also for stealth games. The sequel, Beyond Castle Wolfenstein, would reinforce the game's identity. Later games in the series like Wolfenstein 3D and Return to Castle Wolfenstein introduced the series' longtime protagonist, William Joseph B.J. Blazkowicz, as well as the run-and-gun first-person shooter style, which was and remains ascendant in the genre. The series has also introduced a number of other oddities, such as Wolfenstein RPG, often considered a lighter entry in the series, as well as being slower given its turn-based mechanics, or the more recent sequel to Return to Castle Wolfenstein, Wolfenstein 2009, which has many of the principal characters as its reboot soon to follow, Wolfenstein: The New Order. I say The New Order is a reboot, but for many, this was the role of Wolfenstein 2009. I think of The New Order as the point where the alternative history twist really sets in, and Wolfenstein 2009 is the final stop before that, which nevertheless tried to bring the series back into the modern era of gaming. For the purposes of this essay, we will be considering 4 games, all 3D first-person shooter video games in the continuity of the reboot of the Wolfenstein series, that occurred roughly 1 decade ago at time of writing. Wolfenstein has a proud tradition in gaming, as despite many trials and tribulations, it has always returned to present players with new stories. With a new story comes a new perspective on existing ideas, and the potential introduction of new ideas altogether. I believe that this game series presents a uniquely powerful chance at addressing some ideas in gaming culture that are otherwise kept behind the veil of metaphor. Wolfenstein is many, many things, and subtle is not one of them. Nevertheless, given the subject matter, I will endeavor to be as sensitive as I believe an attempt to gain new insight into this material allows me to be. With all that said, allow me to introduce our 4 principal players in this Wolfenstein Reboot series: Wolfenstein: The New Order, Wolfenstein: The Old Blood, Wolfenstein II: The New Colossus, and Wolfenstein: Youngblood. This essay will be more than a review walking through the core elements of the games and their narratives. It will also be a larger discussion of their cultural relevance, their reception, their context, their ideas, their historical points of reference, and their philosophical elements that arise from these elements. Finally, we will attempt to draw together all of this into a coherent understanding of what the Wolfenstein Reboot series can teach us as players. As always, the greater question here is what we can learn. How can we grow? That's where the fun begins. Wolfenstein: The New Order opens on William Joseph Blazkowicz in an aerial assault on Nazi-controlled Europe, with Allied forces attacking by air and storming the beaches in the fortress wherein the Nazi general Death's Head lies in wait. The group of soldiers is whittled down to only a small handful as they fight their way through water and fire, through sand and stone. In a trap orchestrated by the general, Blazkowicz is forced to choose between Fergus or Wyatt, the veteran lieutenant colonel or the plucky young private. This, along with the massive science fiction mechanical monstrosities in the fortress and on the beach, immediately introduces the feature of the game series for which it is best known, beyond its propensity for shooting Nazis. The Wolfenstein Reboot series is a discourse in alternative history, specifically with World War II. This scene also brings Death's Head into sharper relief as a villain with whom Blazkowicz, and by extension the player, have a more personal relationship. This tone feels immediately both natural and essential to the storytelling of the games. After choosing Fergus in the hopes that he would understand, my timeline in the series begins, and Blazkowicz and his men, including Wyatt, escape a fiery inferno. In choosing to write about these games, I was presented with a stark choice. There is no denying that even as first-person shooter games, they are intensely political, especially when they're doing what they do well. The New Order draws on a few key themes, but all of these themes fittingly orbit the brutality of National Socialism, of Nazism, of fascism and supremacism. That crushing brutality invades one's personal life, and so these games are also, fittingly for a game that is practically about firing guns, about political power's presence in the lives of individuals. But where to begin? It seemed fitting to me to begin with Nazism and those it targets. Immediately, the series brings into sharp relief ideas about disability. Blazkowicz practices foursquare breathing, something with which I am intimately familiar from my experience with dialectical behavioral therapy. In the scenes that follow his survival at the fortress compound, Blazkowicz is disabled, only able to watch the scarcely perceptible days, weeks, months, or years slip by from his chair by the window of an asylum in Europe. I've never been in a coma, but that feeling that's established here with the clever use of the language of cinema is palpable. Words used by abled writers often fail to capture disability through analogy, but at least films, and by extension video game cutscenes, have the power to manifest the sensation, and with that, one hopes the understanding follows. This is a core question for the franchise. How do these games convey that which they intend to convey? How much of what they convey holds with that intention? I don't mean this purely in terms of political messaging, of course, but also in the sense of the particulars of the themes and the poetics of its scenes and play. This series of scenes is where we are introduced to Blazkowicz's love interest and secondary character Anya, as well as her 2 parents who are killed protecting their patients from a Nazi purge. Blazkowicz is barely able to fight off the Nazis and escape with Anya. They meet up with her grandparents where BJ learns the terrible truth, that the Nazis won the war long ago, nuking America into surrender and dominating the world. Fighting their way through Nazi checkpoints, the 4 protagonists vanish into the storm. Flashing forward, BJ is on a train undercover when he runs into Frau Engel, the other main antagonist throughout the New Order, and her companion she calls Bubby. She plays a psychological game with him on the pretense of ascertaining whether he has impure blood, and he brings drinks to Anya in the cabin. After returning to her, the two share a tender moment, and we flash forward again to their attempt to break into a high-security Nazi facility to release the prisoners that they believe are being held there, information courtesy of a Nazi officer threatened with creative use of a chainsaw. After breaking into the prison via elaborate circumvention of Nazi guards and mechanisms using chiefly the laser cover and some more creativity, we're reunited with the soldier we chose to save earlier, in this case Wyatt. After escaping with Wyatt, we're able to head to the rebel compound directly under Berlin, and we can meet our revolutionaries: Caroline, Jay, Bobby, Klaus, and Max. Klaus is a former Nazi and Max's surrogate father, and he helps us prepare plans for a strike at the Nazis. Bobby is the first to die. Mourning the loss of his wife, low on sleep and patience, he drives a car filled with explosives into the massive London Nautica for the sake of blowing away resistance and getting Blazkowicz inside. We fight our way up through the building and recover some documents showing where the Nazis are getting their technological inspiration from, and we acquire a new laser cutter in advance of fighting our way to the airships we need to escape with our friends. Bobby's death so early after meeting him hit me hard because he seemed like he had so much fight in him, but I was forced to consider that sometimes the people who are toughest on the outside are inwardly in great pain. That thought stayed with me on the fight up through the building. I kept thinking about his wife, his bakery, the fighting in London, and then the lack of fighting now. The current mission opens with this after Blazkowicz's recovery and Wyatt's rescue, as if to say, "Here's your fight, Bobby, we're making it count." Klaus from the Kreisau Circle, too, has lost something, his wife and child. Caroline relays his story to Blazkowicz that he and his wife had tried and tried to have a baby, and finally when they succeeded, it was born with a clubbed foot. Klaus and his wife tried to protect their child, but in the struggle against the secret police who came for them, both Klaus's wife and child were killed. Klaus scolds Blazkowicz because, per a mission underneath the Resistance compound, I had to cut through some cement to take a mold sample for Anya. The sound of the saw hurt Max and upset him, and Klaus immediately tried to care for him. Caroline tells the player Klaus's story, and soon after the player has the opportunity to search for some of Max's toys to cheer him up. I immediately made it my life's mission to help reunite Max with his missing toys. He's large and strong, and he doesn't say many words, but he's a gentle soul who doesn't like to hurt others. The Nazi abuse of and disgust for the disabled is a deep through line in Wolfenstein, and it's an immediate theme in the New Order. I was moved by Max on a deep level, and also in the case of his relationship with Klaus. Whereas Klaus feels guilt and remorse for his own past and sorrow at his losses, as well as a deep hatred of the Nazis, I too immediately identified with those feelings, but seeing his relationship with Max, I was reminded of myself in a different light. My youngest brother was diagnosed autistic when I was quite young, maybe 9 or 10, and immediately my mother began learning everything she needed to know to help him. My father worked as hard as anyone could to give him the best help. Notions of severity or functionality are complicated in autism. I don't like either way of speaking about being autistic, but in reality, I didn't used to like speaking about it at all. I too tried my best to learn about autism. In school, I took every opportunity to do research projects and presentations on the subject. Meanwhile, my brother was fighting battles of his own, in ABA appointments, and in mainstream, then special education, then ultimately from special needs school to special needs school. I don't blame my parents. They tried everything to give him the best life in every way they knew how, but in this society, parents of autistic children and the children themselves are not often afforded the ability to help their child or themselves. I continued through my own studies, and one weekend my parents visited me at college. My mother, in a way she probably thought would be helpful, told me she had always thought that I was on the spectrum as well. I became angry with her. I needed her, needed the world, to see that my little brother needed more, needed the world to be better. I had faced the facts long ago that in many ways our family was more about him than anyone else. Accommodating for his future, for his needs, for his quality of life, became the most critical thing at times. It was hard not to feel bitter, even though I knew I shouldn't, and I always told myself that being jealous was selfish, so I never let myself feel those feelings. But when my mother told me I might be like him, that veil was torn open. I didn't want it to be true because it would mean on some level, despite the differences between us, I had been forced to adapt alone. But it was always this way. It hadn't only been Nazis in Hugo Boss boots and swastika armbands that have a contempt for the weak, the deviant, the dysgenic. I think I identified with Bobby Bram's sacrifice not only because he felt like a truly selfless character at his wit's end, holding on for the sake of everyone else, which is something everyone admires, but because he felt like he had missed a crucial time in the past, a time of resistance, where if things hadn't gone the way they did, maybe things now would be different. It's easy to think about one's own past, especially one's own childhood, that way. I've told my mother I was sorry I got angry at her, but in truth, I didn't just feel like I was protecting my brother when I lashed out at her, acting indignant as if she could compare what he was going through to me. I felt like I was protecting myself. I had to confront then that the world wasn't ready to treat an autistic person well, especially if they couldn't detect that I needed help or understand why I was different, let alone a transgender child. Things are slowly changing, for better or for worse. I laid Max's toys down by his bedside tenderly. I wondered if I was doing this for him or because the game told me to. I wondered if I was doing it for my brother or myself. In the end, I looked at Max and I didn't see a difference. I let him rest. Wyatt had his piece to say about my choosing him over Fergus, and I was forced to reflect on the idea that Fergus might have been the logical choice. But Anya has at this point determined that Nazi technology can be sourced to the secrets of the Das Yehud, a covert Jewish organization of as of yet indeterminate nature. What is clear is that one of their members is being held in a concentration camp, so that is where Blazkowicz must go. We can see Frau Engel again at the entrance, but eventually we find ourselves among prisoners with whom we can converse, trade, and ally ourselves as we attempt to break this man, Set, responsible for sabotaging Nazi technology, along with all the other concentration camp prisoners, out of this hell. There's a moving scene where Set and BJ discuss their respective ideas about faith and God. Set says he needs to be able to question the idea of a divine plan, otherwise there's no place for faith. BJ asks him if he still believes. Set says sometimes he wonders what kind of God would allow things like this to happen. BJ suggests that perhaps it is a test. Set sighs deeply and says only that if God is testing us, we are failing gloriously. In historian Ian Kershaw's book, Hitler, the Germans, and the Final Solution, there is a passage that I believe speaks to this question about how such things can begin to happen, or how they can be allowed to happen, which runs as follows. Quote, I have attempted in my own work explicitly to relate lack of humanitarian concern with regard to the Jewish question, to spheres of dissent and protest in quote-unquote everyday matters. My working hypothesis in such research was the notion that, especially under extreme conditions, quote-unquote normal daily and private concerns consume such energy and attention that indifference to inhumanity, and thereby indirect support of an inhumane political system, is significantly furthered. Robert Galately, building on the work of the late Reinhard Mann, has extended such suggestions to the areas of social consensus and active support for policing measures and racial issues. Posit a clear divorce between the concerns of quote-unquote Alltagsgeschichte and the political, ideological, moral framework which focuses upon the genocidal criminality of the Nazi regime is to adopt a misleading perspective. Out of recent work on the social history of the Third Reich, which Brosat did more than most to promote, emerges the realization that there can be a social context in quote-unquote civilized society in which genocide becomes acceptable. Research on the grassroots history of the Nazi era has significantly deepened awareness of the troublesome reflection that, quote, many features of contemporary civilized society encourage the easy resort to genocidal holocausts, end quote. By attempting to shut down the security and obtain a power source for the Nazi machinery, were eventually electrocuted and captured by Frau Engel and her companion Bubby, and sentenced to be executed, along with many other prisoners. However, that power source, that battery, can be passed to Set, whereupon he uses it for his device to take control of the Nazi machine and rescue Blazkowicz and himself. This is the scene with the iconic imagery of Frau Engel's face being torn apart, if you're familiar. We can take the machine and fight our way out of the concentration camp with the remaining prisoners, with a few parting shots from Frau Engel herself. Set explains, back at the compound, that Das Yehud is an organization that creates scientific material as part of an effort to get closer to God, which strikes me as both an act of worship as well as flattery by imitation. Set can help the resistance recover more technology to compete with the Nazis, but it will take some planning and ingenuity. We can have an interaction at this point with Jay, who warns us not to touch his guitar. He doesn't have a lot of respect for Blazkowicz at this stage, not being an overly confrontational individual, but otherwise ignoring him when his attention isn't required. Jay makes it clear what he went through under American segregation, and points out Blazkowicz would have been a tool of American authority if things were different. BJ gets defensive, but Jay reiterates that back in America, people like him were the Nazis. When Blazkowicz manhandles him, Jay points out that he's proving his point, but offers to hear BJ play an acoustic guitar as the two of them go on a trip and Blazkowicz listens to Jay's powerful electric riffs. The Kreisau Circle resistance group, reinforced by concentration camp survivors, set about a plan to get Blazkowicz onto a U-boat, which involves a bit of maneuvering under Berlin through water tunnels. Fighting through the train station to smuggle Blazkowicz aboard, and subsequently fighting aboard the U-boat itself, is fierce, but it's a huge step for the resistance to acquire resources. Once beneath the sea, Set brings Wyatt and Blazkowicz to the Das Yehud Vault, where symbols of Jewish mystical nature are arrayed in a science fiction display of futuristic technology. I opened this essay with a quote from Walter Benjamin, known himself for using ideas around Jewish mysticism in an analytical context, including his understanding of fascism. In order for the Kreisau Circle resistance to complete their plans, Blazkowicz uses a futuristic sphere to destroy the bridge to Africa and kill a science officer so he can take his place and uniform to get to the Nazi moon base. The infiltration is difficult but ends with BJ blasting back down to Earth and fighting off the London Monitor at his crash site near the London Nautica. Klaus coaches the player through the experience as the giant metal monstrosity is whittled down to its last weapons and finally blown to shreds. However, tragedy strikes as Blazkowicz is informed that the Kreisau Circle has been hit. Their base, their home, with Anya and Set and Max and all the others, is under siege and in the process of being purged. When Frau Engel leads the raid on the compound, Klaus drives the player back but takes gunfire to the chest. Max fights to save him, to rescue him from the car. He helps the player into the compound to rescue the others but shuts the door behind him. Hearing his tortured screams, one of us on one side of the door and the other on the other, both of us trapped, I felt something like a proxy to anguish, a sympathetic fear in anger, and that anger comes out in this game in catharsis. All the pain and rage boils into hot lead through Nazi bodies. Moments like these in gaming are hard to come by. They can fall so few and far between and feel so raw that you feel like you're back in the time and place when you first felt like this. Fighting through the burning resistance compound cuts to the bone. Bodies of people you slept near, ate near, and kept safe and fought for are razed and gutted. The things they love are burning. It's a moment where the world of Wolfenstein feels personal, where the macro collapses into micro. We also witness the death of Jay in this scene in the Wyatt timeline. Jay is an alternate history analog for Jimi Hendrix. The estate of Hendrix is notoriously litigious, which at first blush I imagined had something to do with the abbreviated name and the fact that although Jay chooses to die playing his guitar in defiance of the Nazis before they shoot him, he doesn't play a Hendrix song. He actually plays a few chords of the Star-Spangled Banner. Jay being American obviously makes this make some sense, but I did worry that it dances too close to self-indulgent American revisionism in the New Order. Later, however, I reconsidered. Jay is very explicit with his condemnation of racial conditions in America. Calling American GIs the Nazis of America doesn't leave a lot of room for negotiation. I realized I had neglected one thing. Jay might also be playing this song for Blazkowicz. I paused to consider what that meant for his character. Max survives the torrent of gunfire and brings Klaus to the airship where Blazkowicz, Wyatt, and Caroline meet. He tries to revive Klaus, who tells him he's his boy. His final words are haunting. "I wish you could see the strength within you." And so he dies. This, to me, is the sum thesis of the game. If any one moment stands out to unite all the others in a deep and provocative message, across all minority representation and especially disability, political dissonance, and personal connection, it is this: see the strength within you. It is a powerful message to Max and to anyone that the Nazis or any other eugenic ideology would discount, write off, cleanse, or purge. There is strength in what we are, in who we are. That strength is precisely what gives us a chance. Blazkowicz takes his chance with the others to break into Death's Head's compound once again after all these years, tearing down walls he once climbed, another powerful piece of symbolism. Anya and the others taken prisoner are not far. Well into the compound, BJ is jumped by Bubby, Frau Engel's companion, but fights him off when Bubby is unable to incapacitate Blazkowicz with a serum for reasons pertaining to BJ's biology. BJ kills him, and Frau Engel screams in impotent rage. After, still wobbly from the effects of the poison, Blazkowicz meets Anya, Set, and Bombate from the concentration camp, along with the other prisoners as they escape, but he becomes trapped in the elevator and heads up instead to meet General Death's Head. Death's Head meets him at the top and reintroduces him to the brain he took from Fergus, and commences a boss fight with the machine Death's Head is using his brain to pilot. Blazkowicz promises to see Fergus soon after removing and frying what remains of his brain, as Fergus pleads for death. Then, the real boss battle begins. General Death's Head pilots another large mech, this time drawing power from the Zeppelins and siphoning the lightning from the storm above the compound. Death's Head references Thor's lightning and Prometheus's fire in his dialogue about his machinery. The player must navigate their way to the facility's anti-aircraft guns and destroy the Zeppelins in order for subsequent shots to overpower Death's Head's shield, causing the lightning to overwhelm him and cast him into the flaming facility below. After a notoriously fierce fight, Blazkowicz stabs Death's Head fatally, but Death's Head pulls a grenade. Anya brandishes a light shepherding the prisoners as Blazkowicz recites the poem on the Statue of Liberty. BJ Blazkowicz calls out for the nuclear strike. Roll credits over I Believe by Melissa Hollick. I believe, I believe, I believe, I believe, in a beautiful day. The second of the Wolfenstein Reboot games, The Old Blood, is in its name a callback to the previous games. It is also in some respects a remake of Return to Castle Wolfenstein, despite also being a prequel to the New Order. We open on BJ Blazkowicz in 1946 as World War II continues beyond its historical end into alternative history, asleep in a Nazi uniform in a car bound for Castle Wolfenstein itself. He and Agent Wesley get through the checkpoints, in one case by the skin of their teeth, with Blazkowicz alleviating suspicion by making the guards laugh with his supposed impression of an ignorant American. However, Blazkowicz and Wesley are unable to procure the items they've been sent to retrieve, and are captured before they can hope to meet up with their contact. The subsequent level finds Blazkowicz and Wesley in a massive Nazi prison. One of the men Blazkowicz lied to is the torturer, executioner, and apparent warden, Jaeger, who trains the mechanically augmented dogs. A section of the prison appears to also be a sanitarium or asylum, which immediately skyrockets this game into a new level of intrigue for me, considering my adoration for films, shows, and games set in mental hospitals and psychiatric facilities. After hiding from and disabling mechanical super soldiers, evading a giant mechanical hound, and steering a gunboat down the river, Blazkowicz can emerge into the next level, to the docks. Blazkowicz needs to fight through a series of canals and subsequently a number of halls to open a large door to proceed into Castle Wolfenstein proper. The actual medieval portions of Castle Wolfenstein are eerie and heavily occupied by Nazis armed to the teeth. The game does in fact convey a certain nostalgia for the original Return to Castle Wolfenstein, with its level structure using tight hallways, verticality, and stealth sections to replicate a previous generation of Lost Combat. It was this game more than the New Order that convinced me I was playing a reboot of something from the era of Doom. Wolfenstein isn't only a game that presents an alternative history of World War II with a science fiction element, it also, in its reboot and remake games, presents what may be interpreted to be an alternative history of its setting and main character, Blazkowicz. The original series wasn't necessarily always understood to be an alternative history series of games, but reliving the events of the Second World War engenders questions of how to end such a game series, given how that historical series of events came to its conclusion, and these reboot games have an answer. World War II never ended, it only expanded until the Nazis won. I mentioned earlier that The Old Blood is considered to be a remake of Return to Castle Wolfenstein, and there's a sense in which that's true, but it's also its own game. We get a sense that these reboot games are actually their own universe with their own identity, so The Old Blood is more than anything else a prequel to the New Order. Because of the fact that it is, however, both a remake and a prequel to a reboot, The Old Blood has a relatively unique distinction among many video games of attempting to look forward while also looking back, and in multiple ways. It's one thing to adapt something old and try to make it new. This is essentially the challenge of all adaptations and all reboots, but it's quite another to try to snugly fit the work of art into the gap created by a work that has already done this and its predecessors. The name The Old Blood, with relevance to the old Wolfenstein games and Wolfenstein The New Order, is fundamentally apt to the tightrope this game is trying to walk. Blazkowicz finds Wesley in an interrogation room, along with the document that mentions a woman who is likely Frau Engel. Blazkowicz frees him, but he has suffered immense damage and pain. He shakily speaks to the player and teaches Blazkowicz his four-square breathing technique, before he and Wesley are attacked from behind by Jaeger. Blazkowicz gets a surge of strength from the adrenaline of Jaeger stabbing him in the leg, and he breaks out of the chair, electrocutes Jaeger, and kills Jaeger's favorite dog, who would put poor Wesley out of his misery while Jaeger escapes and Nazi soldiers flood the room. This moment touched me deeply because I had always connected with BJ's breathing technique. I call it four-square breathing because that's what the version I was taught in dialectical behavioral therapy was called, due to its 4x4 rhythm. 4 seconds inhaling, 4 seconds holding, 4 seconds exhaling, 4 seconds holding. BJ's mantra was immediately recognizable to me. Count to 4, inhale, count to 4, exhale. For a character so associated with themes of trauma and survival, the narrative deployment of this technique brings the player into BJ's own head, feeling as he feels, breathing as he breathes. Blazkowicz runs for the cable car and is able to fight his way partway across the line before the car is destroyed and he falls into the water. Swimming into a nearby cave, Blazkowicz can sneak into the village to finally meet up with Kessler, and is introduced to the Jewish girl Kessler had been hiding. Blazkowicz is required to defend the two as they escape down into the cellar. Wave after wave of Nazis pour into the tavern, until Blazkowicz finally has his showdown with Jaeger. After burning through ammunition, BJ can finally put the dog down. The player then escapes with Kessler and the girl to cross the river until they part ways. The story of Kessler and Annette is a sad one, with Kessler's wife being executed for political dissidence, inspiring him to betray Germany to the Allies. Annette was on her way to a Nazi concentration camp along with her father, where resistance fighters struck to liberate them, but only Annette made it through. The stories of characters like this lend a great deal of heart to the Wolfenstein series, precisely because of their provocative themes of loss and the connections they find in the wake of that loss, as absolute as it seems. Blazkowicz must sneak or fight through a new town area until he can meet up with the second agent he's supposed to contact. She happens to work in another tavern where Blazkowicz will pose as a waiter to infiltrate the private room of a Nazi leader and steal her documents. But just like the first mission, this second one goes awry when Blazkowicz is caught. While the first half of the game was structured around themes of mechanical augmentation and mechanical hounds in particular, the second is centered around zombification and the Shamblers. While all elements of Wolfenstein have a likely technical science fiction justification, they have a great deal of mystical context as well, not just aesthetically but in terms of their cultural roots. One might question the origin of these ideas in Wolfenstein, what their actual justification is, but I'm reminded of the George Romero zombie film Day of the Dead, and its most powerful monologue. You ain't never gonna figure it out, I think, is a fair approach to Wolfenstein zombies. At one point, while fighting through the Nazis and zombies and the Nazi zombies in the burning towns as zeppelins fall and bodies rise, the player can happen upon both Annette and Kessler. Helping one means letting the other die. In this circumstance, I decided that in the spirit of what Kessler had been trying to do, I should save Annette, and like with Wyatt and Fergus, I hoped Kessler would understand. Wolfenstein is, as I stated earlier, an alternative history series that presents hard alternatives, and so the player's choices and ideals become a reflection of how they react to the setting, even as the setting is itself a twisted reflection of history. Fighting through the zombified town is an otherwise solitary experience, but this is also the case of Wolfenstein generally. Annette asks BJ, "Why do they hate us so much?" And BJ can only reply that maybe it's because something broke their brains. This circumstance and phrasing bring the zombie imagery to bear on the inhumanity of Nazism. And just as Annette and Kessler are a beleaguered island of humanity in a rising tide of inhumanity, so too are the character narratives of the protagonists of the Wolfenstein series, hemmed in thus by fascism. Another excellent turn of environment, like with the Asylum earlier, comes when Blazkowicz has to fight his way to a cemetery in a giant German mech, seemingly a kind of mobile excavator, by plowing through countless Nazi zombies. Eventually, the player arrives in a graveyard, a fantastic aesthetic for a level based around zombies. Many of the enemies in this area are the Nazis the player is accustomed to killing, but when killed, some of them will rise from death to fight not only the player, but other Nazis as well. At the end of the graveyard is a crypt into which Helga and the other Nazis seem to have delved in search of something arcane. After a particularly difficult, fiery room full of zombies, and I do mean particularly difficult, Blazkowicz is captured by Helga and her Nazi compatriots as she attempts to raise the giant monster she's been searching for with all her maps. The golem, of course, has little love for the Nazis and kills or devours them almost immediately. The player must deal damage to the golem's mouth in order to progress the boss phases to lay the creature to rest. Intriguingly, I was familiar with one Jewish story of a golem involving the rabbi Yehuda Lo ben Bezalel, the Maharal or teacher in Prague. Obviously a case of folklore involving the historical figure, the story goes that the Jews in Prague are being mistreated, culminating in a pogrom driven by Christian blood libel. The rabbi animates the golem to protect the Jews by placing a piece of paper with the word Shem into its mouth, which means name. He has to remove the mark regularly to lay the golem to rest, but in one instance where he forgets to remove the paper, or else for some reason the golem goes on a rampage, the rabbi removes the paper and the golem falls apart and is destroyed, its remains interred. That's about as broad and neutral as I can make the story. Not being Jewish, I've only encountered ideas around the Golem of Prague third hand, as accounts of accounts, and I've heard different versions or interpretations, but these are the core ideas necessary to tell you and get you to understand 3 facts. 1. The golem first acts to defend itself from anti-Semites, and otherwise attacks anti-Semites that attack Blazkowicz. 2. The golem will only attack Blazkowicz in retaliation to individual instances of Blazkowicz firing upon it. And 3. The golem must be damaged by attacking its mouth. The implication, I think, is that the Nazis have revived and tried to pervert the golem to their own ends, but likely to its Das Yehud origins, the golem has a certain disposition against violence, almost as if this attack on it was an attack against an innocent, which is itself in keeping with some versions of the story and its interpretations that I've heard. I leave the particulars open to any Jewish audience members to defer to their prerogatives. Helga's last words are, "I lost control," to which Blazkowicz replies, "You don't understand. You never were in control." Melancholic music plays as Fergus rescues BJ from the rubble, even as Blazkowicz relays the information that not only Pippa but also Wesley died. Out of the corner of his eye, Blazkowicz sees Annette reunite with her lover, the young woman she told Blazkowicz about earlier, about dancing and promising to return to her. As Blazkowicz joins Fergus in a convoy, he narrates that this is his last fight before he can rest, but the player knows this fight will continue, on, and if Blazkowicz does not rise to protect the others again and again, there will be no more dancing, no more loving, only monsters. Blazkowicz, in a manner of speaking, becomes the reality of the golem of the story of Wolfenstein through these events. What the audience is meant to take from this is anyone's guess, but as much as Blazkowicz is a power fantasy, in this context he also appears to be a fantasy of preventing great injustices, especially anti-Semitism, and that longing for safety, for power, and the morality tale that comes with it appear to be borne out both in the case of the golem and of Blazkowicz as the player experiences him. It is, in its way, a story of who many of us wish we could be, when we see or suffer great injustices, and of who that person would be if he really lived in the times that we needed him most. He is only human, after all. The true sequel to The New Order begins with Wolfenstein II: The New Colossus. In terms of its plot, the game even opens on the exact moment that The New Order ends. Thematically, The New Colossus also begins with a look into the past, making it also a fitting follow-up to The Old Blood. Blazkowicz's life flashes before his eyes, cutting together scenes from the present and scenes from his childhood, even as Set Roth cuts Blazkowicz's body back together. We see BJ as a child, recovering from being beaten by his father, even as his mother comforts him and the player is forced to recall whether they spared Wyatt or Fergus. We see BJ's father raging at him for being seen in public, being sweet with a black girl his age, denouncing his mother for her Judaism, and being defended by BJ's dog. We see Anya speaking to BJ's comatose form in bed to tell him she's pregnant. We see Caroline trying to revive him. We see BJ being forced by his father to kill the dog that defended his mother. The old and the weak perish, his father tells us, and BJ is weak. So much of the new Colossus directs our attention at the United States of America, at American lives, American identities, American struggles, American beliefs. Because the characters are American, despite the fact that the developer of Machine Games is not based in America, it is also about how these things present themselves in American consciousness, the American self-concept. It made more sense, to my mind, to transition to discourses more appropriately applied to these subjects, while still keeping the view from Europe with Nazism in mind. This is a difficult prospect. The American self-concept has difficulty juxtaposing itself with National Socialism in a manner both self-aware and historically accurate. But in addition to a loyalty to these things, we should be loyal to what the new Colossus seems to be telling us. When Blazkowicz comes to, the Kreisau Circle and their U-boat are under attack by Frau Engel's Nazi stormtroopers. Blazkowicz watches Kreisau fighters fall as he fights his way through the corridors in his wheelchair until he reaches Set Roth, still alive. At some urging from Blazkowicz, Set tells the player how to reach Anya and Caroline. As Blazkowicz struggles through the beginning level, even as he exits it and is saved by Anya, the narrative and dialogue affirms the elements from the earlier game that center disability. When Frau Engel enters the narrative by taking Wyatt and Caroline captive, we're introduced to her daughter, Sigrun, whom she rebukes for being fat. Blazkowicz gives himself up as part of a deal to have the rest of his friends on board the U-boat spared. Sigrun begs for Frau Engel to spare Caroline's life, at which point Frau Engel lectures her again, resolving to force Sigrun to kill Caroline. In the end, she can't do it. Frau Engel decapitates Caroline. She taunts Blazkowicz with Caroline's severed head as the player is left with Caroline's final plea to never give in. Frau Engel is about to do the same to Wyatt, but she taunts Sigrun a third time, using what she read in her daughter's diary to humiliate her. As she aims the axe for Wyatt's neck, Sigrun intervenes, and Wyatt is temporarily free to grab hold of a pistol and shoot the guards as he slides Caroline's armor towards Blazkowicz. The tool that once helped Caroline wield her body, that the Nazis disregarded and looked down upon, now becomes a tool for Blazkowicz to fight back against that same dehumanization. Blazkowicz, Wyatt, and Sigrun drive the guards from the room, whereupon Sigrun pleads with Wyatt to make her death quick. Wyatt shows her mercy, and she agrees to help them free their friends. Blazkowicz must then fight his way to the mechanism that releases the U-boat, then back to the escape pod so the three of them can rejoin the rest of the Kreisau Circle. Blazkowicz also brings Caroline's beheaded body down into the ship. The Circle has regrouped in the months Blazkowicz has spent abed, but they have little time to regroup now again and plan. Wyatt discloses that Caroline's plan was always to begin with the liberation of the United States, such that it can be used to then liberate the world from the Nazis. The hatchet Blazkowicz acquires earlier in the previous level now attains a contextual meaning, like a tomahawk, to be wielded against occupying forces. In the context of the earlier flashbacks of BJ's father, this brings Jay's words from the New Order back into light. Back home, you were the Nazis. The U-boat begins to get hit with depth charges mid-meeting, and Sigrun quickly discloses that somewhere on the ship is someone transmitting their position. Bombate and Set bring Blazkowicz to the likely area, whereupon Blazkowicz goes digging for the rats. The group of hemmed-in Nazis have limited resources, and with clever use of a new explosive weapon, the player can make short work of them. A service is held for Caroline, and Blazkowicz goes to see Wyatt, who is still recovering from his injuries. Wyatt and Blazkowicz remember Jay and his music. Set gives Blazkowicz a checkup of sorts, and the player can find some potatoes to feed the pig on board the U-boat, which Bombate tries to coax Max into letting him put down gently for the rest of the ship to eat, but Max isn't having any of it. For all his developments, his newfound willingness to fight, he's still Max Haas. In his room, we can find a birthday card Klaus gave him, a memento from a surrogate father. Anya asks Blazkowicz to check on Wyatt again, who is still having trouble with the injury to his ear. The Kreisau Circle convenes to establish that, in order to contact the resistance located in the bombed-out nuclear husk of New York City, Blazkowicz will have to enter alone in his armor. BJ emerges from the sub piloted by Bombate and Sigrun, only to see the skeletal remains of the people who perished in the atomic explosion. Men, women, not screaming no more, but I can still hear you, he thinks to himself. This is our first foray onto American soil. New York is gutted and shredded, but no longer burning. The Nazis that patrol for resistance here do so even in the Valley of Death. When Blazkowicz finally makes it to the Empire State Building, he meets Grace and Superspec, the mother-turned-revolutionary and alien conspiracist-turned-rebel. After a standoff testing Blazkowicz before they truly know his identity, BJ throws himself over Superspec to protect the latter from a disarmed grenade as part of a test, or a practical joke, by Grace. They all connect and prepare to return to the Kreisau Circle as Nazis overwhelm the hideout. Hearing Blazkowicz call the Nazis white-ass fascist, being the jarhead that Jay always said he was, adds a certain humorous tone to the scene. The fight is harsh but quick, and the gunships pick up the player for another conversation with Grace and Superspec as they fly on out of the city. Blazkowicz affirms his faith in the American people that they mainly need to be shown a better way. For Grace's plan to work, Blazkowicz must return to the section of the U-boat that he fought through earlier so the Kreisau Circle can have access to the U-boat's nuclear payload. Blazkowicz ponders to himself how his life is slowly fading, and he fears that he would burden Anya with the knowledge of what he feels is his inevitable death. Grace briefs the Inner Circle on the significance of Roswell and her plan to detonate a nuclear warhead to break the Nazi grip on America. Set reveals that Roswell was formerly a Das Yehud holdout until their secrets were used by the United States government too late, far too late, to stop the Nazis. Blazkowicz and Superspec head out and go undercover with the disguised nuclear payload. Superspec saves Blazkowicz from a Nazi officer who recognizes him, and this scene in particular struck a chord with me. The following missions reinforce this view, but by this point it was clicking that the conceptualization of America which pervades the new Colossus is one of a little America occupied by a big Germany. In this America, every man is the man who must fear the police officer when he stops them on the street, because he is something they are not. Their distinctness in this national category parallels on other eras, you might say on other timelines, racial and other distinctions. The game takes every opportunity to reinforce this fact. It has also, however, been said that the religion of America is not Christianity, but nationalism. For a secular society fighting for national liberation, this must have at least some moderate truth. However, the function of this fervor in the new Colossus brings out a dual nature to its Americanness. In Friedrich Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, he writes in Aphorism 260 on the distinction of master morality and slave morality that for master morality, quote, the contrast between good and bad amounts to the contrast between noble and despicable, end quote. That is, becoming and unbecoming of aristocratic values or other such similar self-serving views of the ruler. He equally describes slave morality such that, quote, slave morality is essentially a morality of utility, end quote, describing the evil of slave morality and the good of master morality as having a kind of inverse relationship. They are, in other words, competing moral systems of companion social classes, a fact he clarifies in On the Genealogy of Morality, published 1 year later. Nietzsche says near the end of Aphorism 260 that, quote, a final fundamental distinction, the desire for freedom, the instinct for happiness, and subtleties in the feeling of freedom necessarily belong to slave morals and morality, just as an artistry and enthusiasm and respect and devotion are invariant symptoms of an aristocratic mode of thinking and valuing, end quote. Here we come to it at last. The new Colossus wants to pose American ideals in the role of the ruled and the downtrodden, the marginalized and the dispossessed. Nietzsche's work has a stark review of this idea over 100 years in advance. Quote, but there is no trace of doubt. Just consider to whom you bow down in Rome itself today, as though to the embodiment of the highest values. And not just in Rome, but over nearly half the earth, everywhere where man has become tame or wants to become tame, to 3 Jews, as we know, and 1 Jewess, to Jesus of Nazareth, Peter the fisherman, Paul the carpet weaver, and the mother of Jesus mentioned first, whose name was Mary. This is very remarkable. Without a doubt, Rome has been defeated. However, in the Renaissance there was a brilliant, uncanny reawakening of the classical ideal, of the noble method of valuing everything. Rome itself woke up, as though from a suspended animation, under the pressure of the new Judaic Rome built over it, which looked like a ecumenical synagogue and was called the Church. But Judea triumphed again at once, thanks to the basically proletarian, German and English, Ressentiment movement, which people called the Reformation, including its inevitable consequence, the restoration of the Church, as well as the restoration of the ancient tomb-like silence of classical Rome. In an even more decisive and profound sense than then, Judea once again triumphed over the classical idea with the French Revolution. The last political nobility in Europe, that of the French 17th and 18th centuries, collapsed under the ressentiment instincts of the rabble. The world had never heard greater rejoicing and more uproarious enthusiasm. The language used here by Nietzsche may cause some hesitation, especially in this context of Nazism. What Nietzsche felt in his heart I can only guess, but what this passage means is, I feel, easy enough to interpret on one level and a bit trickier on the other. When Nietzsche describes bowing to Judea in Rome, he is describing the conquest of Rome by Christianity, a moral conquest, a conquest of value systems, dictated over the teachings of an initially Jewish, then strongly Jewish, then subsequently majority Gentile movement. However, it seems apparent Nietzsche has real admiration for the so-called master morality that exists in contrast to Christianity and Judaism. He does not appear to love oppression and discrimination. In fact, he appears to revile what they produce. In truth, Nietzsche seems to love mainly the aspect of master morality that is its source, the ability to command, to dictate, to center. Ironically to this situation, if we look to the works of another 19th century German philosopher, Karl Marx, we can find a perspective where he famously states in his reply to Bruno Bauer, titled On the Jewish Question, that, quote, "The Jew is perpetually created by civil society from its own entrails." The words of both Marx and Nietzsche are, in this instance, polemical but insightful. Marx is speaking to the manner in which those groups which struggle within civil society for rights, that desire for freedom of which Nietzsche speaks, are, contrary to Bauer's limited view, produced by the structure of that society. For every Reich there is a Jew. The parallel phrasing of Bauer's work to the ideology that would one day lead to Hitler and the Nazis' final solution is not a coincidence. A resubmission of the Jewish people to the social power that would eradicate them is a liquidation by one means or another. On the train tracks headed to Auschwitz, Bauer's ideals were the invisible third rail. Marx's words on negative anti-Semitic ideas of the Jew as a huckster and other such similar are his way of pointing at the relation for which the Jew is here a stand-in, which is fundamental to that class society. Without such value relations, without money or finance or class, where would the hucksters, Jewish or otherwise, be? And so it is for Nietzsche, that the class society which produces the morals of the master, so too produce those of the slave. I have expended a great deal of energy in the past, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, speaking on Christianity and the need to feel oppressed. Ironically, this is often the conservative characterization of minority groups oppressed by Christian conservative ideological measures in government. The deployment of American nationalism in the new Colossus rides both sides of this divide. On the one hand, competing notions of American identity are positioned as having the potential to be a rising tide that raises all ships. On the other hand, this version of what Nietzsche might term a slave morality is fit only for the oppressed. In cases where such a moral code becomes the moral justification of dominant members of society, there begins to be an inversion. In one sense, as Nietzsche says, Judaism conquered Rome through Christianity. However, in another larger sense, Christianity was the method by which Rome reasserted anti-Semitism over the Jews. When the powerful take notions of moral rebellion against oppression and appropriate them, they are taking the language of the oppressed away from marginalized groups. Therefore, the new Colossus has a fine line to walk. I think BJ's scene with Jay in the New Order in some ways predicted that this would be a conflict for this series, and the philosophy it presents us, but the new Colossus has intensified that dissonance. In the scene that follows, Superspesh explains his own Roswell conspiracy. Although Blazkowicz contests that the technology coming out of Roswell is aliens, Superspesh is nevertheless satisfied by the opportunity to blow it all to Kingdom Come. The infiltration is difficult, with many mechanized enemies and a long underground train ride between facilities, just like Superspesh described. So aliens or no aliens, BJ plants the nuke and borrows a Nazi's bike to head out to the countryside after triggering the bomb. He winds up near his childhood home, reliving old memories of how he grew up. The player experiences with an eerie trepidation BJ's memory of meeting the girl his father beat him for liking. He remembers her convincing him to save a rat that they caught from drowning, and the two rejoice over a small life saved. The symbolism is not to be lost on the player. In Milton Mayer's They Thought They Were Free, where he chronicles the lives of specific Nazi party members from Hesse who he interviewed after the war, He offers the following characterization of his friendly conversations with these men. Quote, "My friends wanted Germany purified. They wanted it purified of the politicians, of all the politicians. They wanted a representative leader in place of unrepresentative representatives, and Hitler, the pure man, the anti-politician, was the man, untainted by politics, which was the only cloak for corruption. The mink coat scandal of the United States in the 1950s had its counterpart in Berlin in the beginning of the 1930s, when the Nazis focused their campaign for the mayoralty on the receipt by the wife of the Social Democratic mayor of a fur coat from a man who did business with the city. Against the whole pack, the whole caboodle, the whole business, against all parliamentary politicians and the parliamentary parties, my friends evoked Hitlerism, and Hitlerism overthrew them all. The power struggle within the National Socialist Party, which culminated in the Rome Purge of June 30th, 1934, was in essence parliamentary and political, but my friends never knew it. They accepted it as a cleanup of moral degenerates, and if they caught a glimpse of the reality underneath the official propaganda, their nascent concern was dissipated by the fact that the Führer acted with an instant and terrible sword, and the debate with Rome was finished. The Führer held the country and the countrymen together. This was the Bewegung, the movement that restored my friends and bewitched them. Those Germans who saw it all at the beginning, there were not very many, there never are, I suppose, anywhere, called Hitler the Rattenfänger, the rat catcher. Every American child has read the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Every German child has read it too. In German, its title is Der Rattenfänger von Hamelin. Blaskowitz approaches his childhood home. He finds the tree where he and the girl he remembers, Billy, carved their initials, two of a kind. It would take a fool not to see it that way. And this aching wreck out in the countryside has occupied just such a fool. Blaskowitz enters the home and recalls his father teaching him that the world is harsh and cruel, and he must fight back to assert himself against that world if he wants to get ahead. We see young BJ awakened by nightmares, his father watching over him, taking him down to the basement with guns in hand to drive out the monsters in the house. His father reassures him that if he does no wrong, no monster will come for him. But we can remember Grace's words from before. It is not monsters that do these things, but men. And in all fact, it is not a monster that waits for Blaskowitz in this house, but a man. BJ's father, along with the engagement ring his mother promised him, both wait for him upstairs. He lectures Blaskowitz about his various failures and confesses to turning BJ's mother in when the Nazis took over. Blaskowitz, with the knowledge that his mother must have been purged in the concentration camps or simply rounded up and summarily executed, takes the engagement rings she told him to give to someone special and pleads with his father. His father is unyielding. Blaskowitz knocks the shotgun away and cuts off his father's arm before plunging his hatchet directly into his father's chest. Static from the phone line comes through, and BJ knows that the Nazis have been listening. The mobile command center that once captured the U-boat now tears BJ's childhood home apart. Frau Engel recovers BJ's body from the rubble and takes him prisoner. Confined and restrained in a high-security Nazi facility, Blaskowitz waits to die, just like he's been waiting since he survived his surgery. Superspec makes it past the guards by posing as Blaskowitz's lawyer, but is unable to outmaneuver the Nazis and is shot by Frau Engel, who mocks Superspec and taunts Blaskowitz. As he fades away, Blaskowitz has a vision of rebelling at his show trial. He sees a vision of his mother and apologizes for not being there when she needed him. She says they'll be together soon, but Blaskowitz awakens to the real trial and soon proceeds to his execution. Frau Engel gives her speech and draws her sword. Blaskowitz remembers his father's words, "The old and weak are doomed." Then Frau Engel beheads him, holds up his head for the crowd to cheer, and drops it. The game cuts to Set, Anya, Wyatt, Bombate, and Max all sneaking under the Nazis' noses to swap the head quickly after it drops and attach it to a feed of fresh, oxygenated blood to keep Blaskowitz alive in a jar so Set can operate on him again. This time, Set fully attaches Blaskowitz's head to a full-grown super-soldier body, using what is presumably Das Yehud technology. They are overjoyed to see that once again, Blaskowitz has escaped certain death to fight another day. Privately, Blaskowitz thanks Caroline for giving him her wings, and offers them back to her as a symbolic gesture. He spends some time with Anya, finally able to embrace her without thinking about the end. He informs Grace of Superspec's last words, and Blazkowicz is briefed on the situation. Apparently, the Nazis shepherded quote-unquote undesirables into New Orleans and walled off the city. There, they conduct purges. Blazkowicz has to infiltrate a Manhattan Nazi compound shielded against radiation to acquire a dossier on the New Orleans dissidents. Blazkowicz saves Bombate from some mechanized Nazi stowaways and finds Sepp pondering the Das Yehud technology Superspec procured. He calls it the God Key, but its purpose is unknown. Elsewhere, the player can, if they so choose, affirm Blazkowicz's choice from his childhood and save a rat on the U-boat from a trap. "Ain't your fault you were a rat," he says simply. Not much of a philosopher maybe, but a kind heart isn't many times better for the undesirables of the world, rats or otherwise. Bombate and Sigrun seem to have bonded. Wyatt seems to have recovered strangely from his head injury, or the drugs are getting to him, probably both. It's time to break into Nola. Deep inside the city, Blazkowicz finds his class-conscious bohemian leftist revolutionaries. Horton and his men are happy to see Blazkowicz, but Horton puts BJ through a test where he passes him drink after drink, while arguing politics until BJ passes out. When he awakens, the Nola revolutionaries rally to break out of the city and join the Kreisau Circle. As an aside, riding the giant fire-breathing Panzerhound through the streets and lighting up every Nazi in sight is remarkably satisfying. Blazkowicz has to fight back to his people in a high-octane level soundtracked to what I can only describe as the vibes of 28 Days Later meets The Matrix. The amount of killing is appropriate. Wyatt has the craziest idea ever, and the Circle pushes the U-boat back out to sea by firing its nuclear cannon. With Horton and his people aboard, the Circle plans to get Blazkowicz aboard Hitler's own Nazi installation on the planet Venus, posing as actor Julius Redfield, auditioning for the part of, you guessed it, Terror Billy, aka William Joseph Blazkowicz. This time, it's Anya's crazy idea, so who can argue? The scene where the director introduces Blazkowicz to the other actors as BJ prepares for the director's arrival is another opportunity for the alternative history element of Wolfenstein to enter the frame again, as we meet not one but two important historical figures in this scene. The first is young aspiring actor Ronald Reagan. The next is about who you'd expect. Adolf Hitler's illness has advanced fully into delirium, incontinence, limited mobility, and of course, seething, unrestrained rage. Hilariously, not only does Hitler believe none of the actors, including BJ, look anything like Terror Billy, the scene takes every opportunity to lampoon his poor artistic skills, especially his awful writing. When Ronald Reagan offends him, Hitler simply shoots him to death. He holds his gun on Blazkowicz and forces BJ to recite his lines, whereupon the player had better have committed the words to memory, or with enough deviation Hitler will kill them. The actor, Johnny Anthony, gives a better read, but on the physical audition, the actor Llewellyn Ewing is also shot to death by Hitler. BJ's turn comes next, and of course you know I had to give Hitler an obligatory kick. After Blazkowicz brutally kills the Nazi soldier in the audition, Hitler says he's perfect for the role, and of course kills the last actor, Johnny Anthony. Back in his room, Blazkowicz gets another satisfying kill on an unsuspecting Nazi guard before heading to obtain his true goal, the Odin codes used to deactivate Frau Engel's giant robotic installation, the Ausmerzer. BJ has to fight his way out of the facility and traverse its exterior, refilling the coolant in his air suit to keep the harsh atmosphere of Venus at bay. This is a relatively satisfying if slightly difficult section when approaching it via stealth only, and while it doesn't come quite as close to the ideal Wolfenstein modern stealth experience as the Old Blood, it's pretty darn close, and coupled with the new Colossus' vibes, it's a great moment in the game. When Blazkowicz makes it back to the U-boat, all his friends surprise him with a birthday celebration. It's a sweet moment. Sigrun seems to be having trouble and takes issue with Grace calling her a Nazi. Grace, for her part, gives a rousing speech to jumpstart the celebration. Seeing the Kreisau Circle get these sweet little moments is a fantastic opportunity for some emotional catharsis in the narrative. I think as much as killing Nazis is itself cathartic, tying together the tense combat and tragic death with something fun, sweet, and beautiful, seeing our heroes in a moment of genuine bonding, is what brings everything together. The player needs to understand that this isn't just a game about revenge, it's a game about liberation, and the developers seem to have understood that. All is not exactly well for everyone on all fronts. Some of the crew are anxious, dealing with their own difficulties as always. Wyatt is missing. Blazkowicz has to search for him, picking up a lead in the lounge and bar set up inside the U-boat. By the way, there's actually a machine in here that just straight up lets you play Wolfenstein 3D, like in the Nightmare sections of the previous two games. I thought I'd mention it now since it's a pretty fantastic little feature of the modern games that the developers put in. I love that they do things like this. Blazkowicz finds Paris, who recollects that Wyatt wasn't feeling so good the night before, lost in his own troubles. He finds him deep past the shooting range, recollecting how his mother killed herself, contemplating suicide. Set relays that the Das Yehud used psychedelics like those Wyatt has been deep in, but that Wyatt has been seeing further, and in passing, Wyatt tells Set that the God key is a doorknob. Grace breaks down the plan, and Sigrun explains what the Odin codes revealed. When Grace calls her a Nazi, Sigrun stands up to her, winning Grace's respect with her assertiveness. The team makes to infiltrate the Ausmerzer and execute the plan. Anya and Blazkowicz enter to make for the control center. The two of them get separated, and Blazkowicz has to fight his way up through the control center past endless mechanized Nazis. At the top, a Panzerhund jumps Blazkowicz, but Anya is quick to save him in another of the most memorable scenes of the series, on par with seeing Frau Engel get her face ripped apart. It's a majestic hail of blood and bullets, and there's something powerful about a topless pregnant woman being the one to do it. The Kreisau Circle see that Frau Engel is preparing for an interview on live television and sees their chance, having disabled the Ausmerzer. They hold the production crew at gunpoint, and Blazkowicz approaches the stage. Sneaking in close, he rushes Frau Engel and splits her skull with his hatchet. For Bobby, for Jay, for Klaus, for Fergus, for Caroline, for Super Spesh, for his mother, for everyone. He tells her, if that's your best, then your best just won't do. Grace takes command of the situation and prompts Wyatt to speak to Americans everywhere in the still-rolling broadcast. Wyatt says, quote, Americans wherever you are, I wish I had words of comfort to give you like the warm winds that this Nazi general sent down from above. But from me you will not get comfort, only the cold, agonizing truth. And the truth is that this great nation has been raped and pillaged by the greatest enemy of our time. They ask you to sell your liberty, to purchase your safety, to kneel to the new order, to submit to the winds of change, but my fellow Americans, they that sow the wind shall reap the whirlwind. You were born in the land of the free, you fought the kings of old and broke them. You gave your lives for the simplest and most essential truth of all. Give me liberty or give me death. In your veins runs the blood of revolutionaries, so tonight, brandish your guns, your knives, and your fists. Seek out your oppressors wherever they are, and tell them, we don't want nothing, not a thing from you. Tonight, we show those that sow the wind that we are the whirlwind. Roll credits over a cover of Twisted Sister's We're Not Gonna Take It. The speech is imperfect. It's tinged with shades of nationalism, of a romantic American past. In truth, although the game itself is an alternate history, I think this is the most didactic moment in the game. How could it not be when Wyatt addresses the audience directly straight into the camera? Such a narrative moment is worthy of criticism for how it's handled, but I think a bit of self-awareness is also in order. Too often, social critics approach messaging in media for popular analysis as if political messaging meant to be received by audiences and carried into developing a better future, as this moment almost assuredly is supposed to tell the audience how to solve their problems. The truth is, this is more fantastical than any alternative history fiction. No story about our past and present, even one that acknowledges our problems, can resolve them by telling us what to do next. What we receive from such moments, what we take away and hold on to, should be recognition. This is a time to look into the mirror. This isn't about tomorrow exactly, it's about today, about who we are right now, and who we've been. That's the understanding that carries us forward. In a post-credits scene, Blazkowicz takes his mother's ring from Frau Engel's body and kneels before Anya to propose in the scene of the day's victory. Victory for William Joseph Blazkowicz. Following in the wake of Wolfenstein II: The New Colossus was always going to be a difficult prospect, but it was made more difficult by the development team's creative decision to go ahead with doing another game in parallel with The Old Blood. However, Wolfenstein Youngblood had a twist. Instead of jumping back, the game would jump forward. Instead of offering context for Blazkowicz's past exploits, the game would focus on an era where Blazkowicz has already had his greatest triumphs. As a title outside the current Reboot chronology like The Old Blood, the game has a different set of challenges. Unlike The Old Blood, however, this game has a lot to prove. Youngblood features 2 playable characters, neither of which are Blazkowicz himself, but which do lend themselves to a co-op playstyle that at least theoretically brings a fresh take to the series. The game, true to this central player choice, opens with the usual decisions of difficulty and brightness settings, but now has the added bonus of allowing players the largely cosmetic decision of which sister to play as, Jess or Soph. The names of these 2 characters seem to be nods to other popular or important female characters from elsewhere in the Wolfenstein universe, namely Zofia Blazkowicz, and potentially also, although I've never seen this confirmed, Jessica Valiant from the DLC for the new Colossus. Players have the ability to customize loadouts for their playthrough from the start, which involves some degree of choosing from where the character in question begins their journey. These 2 characters are BJ and Anya's twin daughters, previously seen only via Anya's pregnancy and Blazkowicz's dreams in the New Order. In some ways, this means a game like this was being built to for a long time. The opening cutscene shows BJ teaching Jess how to hunt, and Anya teaching Soph how to box. The emphasis of both lessons is on awareness and endurance, respectively. We can glean from the context that these scenes appear to be a few years on from when BJ's dream of the future with Anya and his kids in the yard takes place. The game cuts forward again to Jess and Soph with their friend Abby, also the daughter of Grace from the previous game, speaking with some members of the Resistance about their father, most notably a French woman named Juju. The sisters wear the power suits that the player picked out for them earlier in the character loadout screen. They're looking for BJ, fearing he's been captured. We flash forward again to the girls killing their first Nazi. The first of these 3 cutscenes is a little cliché, and the second feels a bit contextless, like a strange leap forward without the necessary connective narrative tissue. The third cutscene, however, works well to give the girls a little characterization. Their relationship is sweet, as much as they are very much their mother and father's children in terms of their personalities. As we cut to the gameplay of their first mission, we're reassured by their mission control that they can do this. They are, after all, the daughters of the man who killed Adolf Hitler. Hearing this gave me complicated feelings. On the one hand, it's to be expected. The game is set farther in the future. Of course Hitler is probably dead by now one way or another, and of course Blazkowicz was the one to do it. Of course we can read about this story in out-of-game material. There are many of courses here. But that logic cuts both ways. Of course this game feels a little directionless in terms of lacking an obvious antagonist. The New Order set up General Deathshead as well as Bobby and Frau Engel as side villains. The Old Blood focused on Jaeger in the first half and Helga in the second. The new Colossus focused chiefly on Frau Engel again, but introduced Hitler in the flesh. Because Youngblood opens on an acknowledgement that Hitler is long dead, there's no obvious continuity in its antagonists. This isn't inherently a problem, of course, except that this is Wolfenstein we're talking about. If Youngblood was going to focus on a character other than Hitler, it should have been someone from the previous games. This series relies on emotional catharsis from killing Nazis, which means the Nazi villains are built up, usually from previous games or from real history. This means that Youngblood feels like it loses momentum at its beginning, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but it's only the start of its troubles. Before we continue on down that line of thought, let's talk shop on the gameplay mechanics. Things are largely improved upon from previous titles, as one would hope. Where the Old Blood didn't iterate much on the New Order except for which guns were in the game due to a difference in time period, Youngblood has a lot of gameplay alterations even compared to the new Colossus. A few things I don't love include the way a lot of pickups look similar, including having the same white highlight around them. You just sort of end up indiscriminately picking up whatever you see without thinking, whereas rationing health and armor pickups in particular could be a useful strategy in the previous games. It also feels a bit like the scenery has undergone some aesthetic changes that make the Third Reich and its various NPC adversaries feel slightly less Nazi-like. The resemblance is definitely still there, but the previous games established a definite look that this game deviates from in a noticeable manner. There is also a change I feel neutrally about, which is the addition of health bars. This adds a little clarity to the combat, but generally feeling out a sense of when enemy types had taken enough damage was a real skill developed in the previous games that seems to matter less now, despite the fact that this change does make the game more friendly to those who played other shooters but never a Wolfenstein game. However, I have to say that while the gunplay of the other games is good, it feels like it got a noticeable upgrade in this game. Level traversal and movement also makes the characters feel like they can be used more creatively. Ultimately, a game like this is not to be judged on its first level, but nevertheless, I saw some positives and negatives worth taking away. The boss fight of this level is General Winkler. He talks to the player a little over the level, but is otherwise unremarkable, except for two things. As a tutorial, and as a funny kill when the player is able to shoot his hands and cause him to get sucked into the Zeppelin's engine turbine. We next see a flashback of Abby and the sisters speaking while Grace and Anya speak about the disappearance of BJ under mysterious circumstances. Grace seems to have undergone a significant transformation into the head of the FBI, which is a strange narrative choice. It's almost a little depressing in itself. In previous titles, Blazkowicz's jarhead attitude and white bread country boy background were juxtaposed with a diverse cast of characters, and those points of contrast lent themselves to an equally diverse series of perspectives. The cast is still diverse in terms of the identities represented, but the variety in character perspectives doesn't seem to be broadened much by this at the outset. If anything, these character backgrounds have collapsed into a larger American identity, which is exactly the kind of thing that I had personally feared from the moment I noticed the theme of American nationalism in contrast to German nationalism taking place from the New Order to the New Colossus. My genuine reaction to seeing the Nazi derivative gunships painted black with the FBI logo on them was, is this the world Jay and Super Spesh died for? I keep hearing Jay's words ring throughout this game. Back home, man, you were the Nazis. In the groundbreaking book, Cast: The Origins of Our Discontents, author Isabel Wilkerson draws together a way of seeing social stratification of American society by using language and comparisons that are descriptively instructive. One analogy built into the title and mentioned at the beginning of the book is the caste system of India. Another the author invokes soon after is the Nazis. She describes the Nazi inspiration from the American model in a few passages, including the following. Quote, "The Nazis needed no outsiders to plant the seeds of hatred within them. But in the early years of the regime, when they still had a stake in the appearance of legitimacy and the hope for foreign investment, they were seeking legal prototypes for the caste system they were building. They were looking to move quickly with their plans for racial separation and purity, and knew that the United States was centuries ahead of them with its anti-miscegenation statutes and race-based immigration bans. Quote, for us Germans, it is essentially important to know and see how one of the biggest states in the world with Nordic stock already has race legislation which is quite comparable to the German Reich," end quote. The German press secretary Großdeutscher Pressedienst wrote as the Nazis were solidifying their grip on the country. Western Europeans had long been aware of the American paradox of proclaiming liberty for all men while holding subsets of its citizenry in near total subjugation. The French writer Alexis de Tocqueville toured antebellum America in the 1830s and observed that only the, quote, surface of American society is covered with a layer of democratic paint, end quote. Germany well understood the US fixation on race purity and eugenics, the pseudoscience of grading humans by presumed group superiority. Many leading Americans had joined the eugenics movement of the early 20th century, including the inventor Alexander Graham Bell, the auto magnate Henry Ford, and Charles W. Eliot, the president of Harvard University. During the First World War, the German Society for Racial Hygiene applauded the, quote, dedication with which Americans sponsor research in the field of racial hygiene, and with which they translate theoretical knowledge into practice, end quote. The Nazis had been especially taken with the militant race theories of two widely known American eugenicists, Lothrop Stoddard and Madison Grant. Both were men of privilege, born and raised in the North and educated in the Ivy League. Both built their now discredited reputation on hate ideology that devised a crude ranking of European quote-unquote stock, declared Eastern and Southern Europeans inferior to quote-unquote Nordics, and advocated for the exclusion and elimination of races they deemed threats to Nordic racial purity, foremost among them Jews and quote-unquote Negroes, a racial slur that the Nazis adopted in their campaign to dehumanize Jews and other non-Aryans. The word Untermensch, meaning subhuman, came to them from New England-born eugenicist Lothrop Stoddard. A 1922 book he wrote carried the subtitle The Menace of the Underman, which translated into Untermenschen in the German edition. The Nazis took the word as their own and would most become associated with it. They made Stoddard's book on white supremacy a standard text in the Reichsschule curriculum and accorded him a private audience with the purposefully remote Adolf Hitler at the Reich Chancellery in December 1939. Well into World War II, Stoddard sat in on Nazi sterilization trials and commended the Nazis for, quote, weeding out the worst strains in Germanic stock in a scientific and truly humanitarian way, end quote. He lamented, though, that, quote, if anything, their judgments were almost too conservative, end quote. Madison Grant, a leading eugenicist from New York whose social circle included Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover, converted his zeal for Aryan supremacy into helping enact a series of American immigration and marriage restrictions in the 1920s as the Nazi Party was forming across the Atlantic. Grant went far beyond Southern segregationists in his contempt for marginalized people. He argued that, quote, inferior stocks, end quote, should be sterilized and quarantined in, quote-unquote, a rigid system of elimination of those who are weak or unfit, or perhaps worthless race types. Grant published a rabid manifesto for cleansing the gene pool of undesirables. His 1916 book, The Passing of the Great Race, the German edition of which held a special place in the Führer's library. Hitler wrote Grant a personal note of gratitude and said, "The book is my Bible," end quote. Wilkerson goes on with other examples of Nazis citing American inspiration, but on the matter of the racial ideology of Hitlerism, I thought this was sufficient. There were times when playing Youngblood that I almost felt what the developers were going for. However, this choice feels borderline unforgivable. Nothing they could have done, bar making Blazkowicz or Anya or any of the others Nazis themselves, would have done so much to betray the moral core of what these characters represent and fulfill the dark promise of the New Order and the New Colossus of an American exoneration, an America that fails to fully see itself in Nazism, an America that does not learn, an America that does not refuse to forget but rather is incapable of remembering. Ironically, or perhaps fittingly, this choice so thoroughly indicts the more uplifting anti-establishment American patriotism in the previous games that even accidentally it has created a damning indictment of that sentiment writ large. American nationalism repeats the mistakes of the Reich, because they are the mistakes of American nationalism, and they serve its interests too. It does not help any of this to hear from Abby that Set Roth died, and that the Dacia hood technology he once helped Blazkowicz recover for Caroline, and which thereafter was Caroline's parting gift for Blazkowicz, her wings, is now standard issue for Nazi higher-ups. The game opens by implying Blazkowicz lived a life of success in some regard, but at every turn the world we actually see, even with a supposedly liberated America and a France yearning for the same, actually all appears to be a failure. We didn't learn. We went right on disrespecting the dead. Apparently, as it turns out, we are going to take it. Fighting through the streets of Paris allows for some more positive commentary. Even in a solo campaign, the player still plays along their chosen character's sister, and the two have, in addition to their chosen abilities, an extra ability to help each other. They can also revive each other when downed and share a limited stock of lives. The game also has a leveling system which allows the sisters to grow stronger as the game advances, and at this point in the story the player should have a feel for how this relatively simplistic system works. In the following cutscene, Juju teaches the sisters to smoke and Abby debriefs them on BJ's likely location, a top-secret Nazi facility whose location itself is unknown. Jacques has a strange little interaction where he gives Soph a chess piece. The two sisters set out to strike at the Nazis from their compound in the Paris catacombs. On the other hand, a difficulty I have with this combat is a part of something I mentioned earlier. The presentation of the health bars and lack of consistent intuitive damage breakpoints for enemies is owed to the fact that enemies are also leveled. This makes the game feel somewhat grindy almost immediately, as searching for resources to get upgrades will mean doing side missions, which are leveled themselves, so you have to balance your need to progress through the main storyline with your need to build up your character. Really, this is a half-truth. Instead of need, maybe willingness would be a better word. I really wanted to like this game, but I only got a couple levels deep before realizing that I wasn't at all interested in the story. The characters are fine, but the New Order and the New Colossus sold themselves with how snappy and hard-hitting their stories were, in the cutscenes in particular. This game has a story, and it has cutscenes, But if it's trying to be like any of the other games, then The Old Blood probably comes closest, and The Old Blood was a linear story that sold itself slightly less on the characterization of its antagonists, in the way that Youngblood also doesn't, and more on the strength of its setting. But Youngblood's setting is scattered and divided, really more of an open-world romp with a couple fun characters. Youngblood repeatedly introduces the player to circumstances that have the general trappings of the previous games, but little of what made them compelling. In the first place, when I killed Bubby, Deathshead, Jaeger, Helga, or Frau Engel, I felt something. These were characters with whom Blazkowicz had established enmity. Youngblood needs something like this to make the slaughter of Nazis meaningful. I don't think it takes much, but frankly there's something dissonant about the prospect of trying to shoot one's way out of fascism generally. You can kill people with bullets. Ideas and social systems are a different matter. They require a more deft structural approach with broad social change. In Against World Building and Other Provocations, Alexis Kennedy writes in a piece originally published for Eurogamer called Punching Nazis that, quote, "But what about the Second World War, Alexis? The Second World War wasn't something we did to the Nazis. It was something the Nazis did to us. It was a war of aggression waged against democracies. The democracies fought in self-defense, and that self-defense was horribly ineffective in preventing genocide. 2/3 of the Jews in Europe had already been murdered by the time the Allies liberated the camps, and most of the rest had fled. I'm bloody glad the democracies won, but the war was a desperate last measure and the star catastrophe of the 20th century. Any solution that requires the deaths of 60 million human beings is not a solution that we want to return to unless as an absolute resort." I have a few thoughts on this piece. I think Kennedy's political points miss the mark for two key reasons. The first of these is that I think his understanding of the Second World War cuts a bit against the history that I've read in preparation for covering these games. Setting aside that war of aggression is a redundant phrase, I understand what Kennedy means when he says the Nazis were responsible for attacking democratic nations. I agree that people who uphold the Second World War as a legitimate case of successful action against the Nazis gone right are overlooking its tragedy and failure, but I don't think that's the point people are making when they invoke World War II. The point others are making, presumably, is that even these liberal democracies needed to eventually turn to violence, and by the time they did, the conditions were catastrophic. This throws the violence Kennedy is looking to avoid in the light of the inevitability of his logic. Kennedy, however, throws those conditions back in the faces of his interlocutors, without reckoning with the fact that his preferred course of action helped create those conditions, especially when taking into account Hitler's rise in the Third Reich from a form of previously democratic government. Presumably, the point others are making is that sometimes violence is necessary, and perhaps earlier violence prevents later violence. For this, Kennedy actually does have a retort, and he says, quote, "I want to give the nearly final words to Nietzsche and Libovic. Violence from opponents of fascist regimes usually gives more intense overt power to that regime. In any of the cases I know, it plays into the hands of the regime and is used as an excuse to harshen the punitive measures against critics. It doesn't benefit those who are interested in democracy," end quote. Who's Nietzsche and Libovic? He's chair of Holocaust Studies at a Pennsylvania university, and, incidentally, Jewish. I'm pretty confident that he's not a fan of Nazis. Kennedy goes on to say that, quote, "When you punch a fascist, it's as effective as throwing Brer Rabbit into the briar patch. When you actually debate a fascist, their arguments fall apart like a badly thumbtacked MDF." Amid examples of anti-Nazi violence, Kennedy mentions the Reichstag fire and says it allowed the Nazis to campaign on the specter of communist violence and seize a majority in Germany's parliament. Kennedy probably doesn't literally believe the Holocaust was unavoidable, but he does say World War II should have been avoided until all other options were exhausted, that the Nazis started it, and that only civil discourse, not violent action, could have prevented it. Kennedy brings up Richard Spencer getting punched by a Black Bloc protester, and how Spencer went on to share the footage himself. He says, quote, "Punching a real-world Nazi makes people who see the punch, people who aren't Nazis but maybe have some dodgy ideas, wonder if actually the Nazi has a point. The picture Kennedy is painting here is one where the violent actions taken against the Nazis are, by consequential extension, what allowed the later violence by Nazis to occur. I find this implicit view to be morally reprehensible in itself, which is the soul of my first objection. Consider Milton Mayer's work, where he describes the actions a Polish Jew took in shooting German diplomat Ernst von Rath and von Rath's subsequent death, which acted as fuel for anti-Jewish rhetoric that inspired a different kind of burning, notably from Mayer's own book, The Burning of the Jewish Synagogue in Cronenberg. As a Jewish journalist who lived through and infamously objected to the Second World War, at least in his early days, Mayer doubtlessly would have Kennedy's sympathies, any disagreements pending. It is, of course, not the case that death is preferable to debate for non-fascists, but rather that the implication that violence against Nazis is responsible for Nazi violence removes much of the actual cause, which is on the Nazis themselves. Who's to say that in the absence of the shooting of von Rath that the synagogue would not have burned regardless, if not that year then the next? Eventually the Jews too would burn. How can we even begin to calculate the responsibility of a small handful of anti-Nazi actors while drowning in the torrents of blood on Nazi hands? Even treating the Nazis as a constant, and if we must, that bodes poorly, and avoiding that their willingness to treat individual Jews as representative of all Jews is a lie, this claim still operates in a gray area. There are too many unknowns to forward this claim. But this plays into the second point of contention I have with Kennedy's sentiment. Kennedy's words on debating Nazis conform to the first quoted passage, which continues as follows, quote, "And more importantly still, the political struggle against Nazism, the use of free speech to defeat odious ideas, was won by politicians and activists against the fascist movement in every Allied country before the Second World War even began. Without that, we'd have been stuffed before the war even began. Imagine if a pro-fascist movement had come to power in the US or the UK, and one or both had stayed out of the war. Right now, there'd be Nazis in Westminster gleefully agreeing that punching is the best way to deal with liberals. You can't punch an ideology to death. Ideologies, even vile and stupid ones like fascism, are famously resilient to being punched. But when fascist arguments are exposed to common sense and daylight, the audience can see them as the evil bollocks they are. And this is the other big difference between video games and life. In a game, you're both the player and the audience. There's no one else to convince. In life, when you argue with a fascist, it's the people watching that you have to convince. Convincing the fascist is a very rare bonus. If you punch the fascist, you're telling the audience, my arguments weren't good enough to win, end quote. Setting aside that, as I've already demonstrated with a quotation from Wilkerson's book, fascism was not at all defeated in America in advance of the Second World War, and Kennedy's insinuation that it was is absolute ignorance, I want to be clear that I agree with Kennedy's skepticism around violence about not just its use, but its consequences. These things deserve careful thought. What I do not agree with can be most easily summarized in his invocation of common sense. I have lived in the hell of common sense. When I was a child, it was common sense that transgender women like myself were disgusting. If one kissed you, you'd spit. If one touched you, you'd shove her. And if you even so much to happen to look askance of one as she walked the streets, ridicule was expected. There's your common sense at work. In Germany, as in many places, it was the case that Jews were to blame for many of society's problems. That was the common sense, at least, of some men, as Mayer lays out all too chillingly in his book. Many people thought nothing of it. Common sense will get you. In America, it is still common sense that work is good for the soul, that a man must work in this capitalist economy to earn his freedoms as expressed through his dollar, and being so capitalist, we are all the freer. It is a very dominant Christian sentiment tracing its roots to the New Testament. Arbeit macht frei, work makes one free, was written on the gates to Auschwitz's concentration camps. There rose the smoke and vapors of common sense. Common sense really represents no more than the most readily apparent elements of what views are mainstream in society. The underlying views, beliefs, ideologies, or analytical frameworks that motivate common sense are what is sometimes called the doxa of society, which arises from the Greek term for essentially a similar idea as common belief. In culture, the doxa is not inherently worthy of respect. It may motivate what seems, for lack of knowledge, to be either miracles or tragedies. It is, however, inherently worthy of study. Any look at anti-Semitism will inevitably be concerned with how such views create and motivate anti-Jewish ideas. Kershaw's work itself addresses the nuances of anti-Semitism in the Nazis' final solution, and he adds that, quote, Once in power, the Nazi regime had not the slightest difficulty in finding among elites and among ordinary Germans collaborators who, for a variety of motives, many of which had little to do with anti-Semitism, were prepared to push through and implement discriminatory policies which created their own spiral of radicalization, and that, quote, though not an active consensus, it is a consensus nevertheless, end quote. Consensus is one word for it. Perhaps common sense or doxa might be others. All point to ideas beneath the surface that motivate such political occurrences. In the context of this cultural conversation, there is one key element of our cultural doxa that goes too often unexamined. Look at Kennedy's comments on how punching Nazis makes people with dodgy ideas wonder if the Nazis had a point. Look also at Kennedy's expressed sentiment that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Look again at his idea that choosing violence over debate indicates to the audience for whom the appeal must be made that the position of the victim of violence is superior. These are cultural presuppositions, ways of thinking that have human social origins. The most famous of these is the martyrdom of Jesus Christ. Like Christianity portrays Jesus on the cross, society calls upon the Jew to suffer for the original sin of society itself. Kennedy's view here is not unique. He is saying what very many people in our culture believe. The ask of civil society is that any minority, Jew or otherwise, make an appeal to mainstream society. The marginalized must appeal to the center which has created them. In Kennedy's missteps, we can hear the echoes of an old debate. What would Marx say? Kennedy is asking Jews and all other such groups to ice skate uphill in their own demographic self-interest. Never mind that the state which has granted such wonders as liberal democracy with its freedom of speech, a much more tenuous claim for a journalist in the United Kingdom to make, I must say, creates these groups by necessity. Here we find that our moral conscience is split in twain. If we do as is prescribed to us, we are acting in our in-group self-interest and civil society's self-interest, without regard for the larger dynamic and with the full knowledge that there will be other groups as us, and this is all assuming we succeed. What should happen if the center of civil society is unmoved? If our social betters should decide we simply have not yet earned enough of their sympathies? Then more of us will die. Perhaps should die is more operative of Kennedy's way of thinking, although he would presumably never intend to suggest something so monstrous. Still, Richard Spencer's career was deeply injured by one of his supporters killing Heather Heyer at Charlottesville. Other neo-Nazi killings also did his movement great injury. It seems to push the dial on what many thought of Spencer's alternative right movement. Perhaps Americans would have rejected it anyway. That was certainly fewer deaths than the Holocaust to stop a Nazi movement, assuming Kennedy's line of reasoning holds. But that minority groups were placed in such a position in the first place was the original injustice. Is it a good society that every so often crucifies a person to test the worth of their peers? What this means for us, if we look at the underlying ideology of not just the Nazis and their would-be successors, but also liberal democratic civil society, is that this society is logically predicated on an immense injustice that make these things possible to begin with. You may recall Kennedy's invocation of Litzan Leibovic's words that such violent tactics do not benefit those interested in democracy. But should we be so invested? This all should make my second and greater objection to Kennedy's logic clear. Even in the ways in which he is right, his argument is self-defeating. He has laid out nothing more or less than a total indictment of liberal society. I have to thank him for that. In Youngblood, I was promised the ability to kill Nazis, and presumably that should mean something. I think it requires a face and a name. I think it requires tragedy. As sad and strange as it sounds, when resistance fighters are discovered dead in the early levels, I don't feel anything. They aren't like the bodies in bombed-out Manhattan who represent real people who lived in a world I could know. They're faceless like them, but their facelessness doesn't construct anything. They aren't like the named characters we've seen die, like Bobby or Jay or Wesley or Fergus or Caroline or Super Spesh. They're resistance fighters and rebels like them, but they lack their identities. They represent figures much like the ones we're playing as, and so they require a characterization of their own in order to lend our playable characters' experiences meaning. I was frustrated in some of these encounters. I firmly believe leveled enemies were a mistake from a design perspective, as interesting as the upgrade system for the characters is, and as fun as the co-op mechanics can be. I like the kind of BioShock Infinite style of buff in terms of ammunition, armor, or health that the two players can give each other. I like the Resident Evil 6 style mechanics of helping each other open doors or crates. I think people were excessively hard on this game, but it's easy to understand the disappointment. I feel it too. I'm not averse to appreciating the black sheep of the family. I like games other people don't always like. I even enjoy them from a critical perspective many times. Dark Souls 2, Dragon Age 2, Borderlands 3, Mass Effect 3, the list goes on, and we'll touch on all of these one day. Even this game is okay when you get right down to it. It's a fine shooter title, but it's lacking the secret sauce. This feels more like a spin-off game than a main Wolfenstein title. The main story missions of Youngblood are built around pursuing the Brothers. These are 3 installations which the twins infiltrate for the purpose of gaining full access to the computer systems and allowing Abby to pull any information about how to find BJ and save him. The game seems structured such that you can complete them out of order, which is fine, although again, it does seem to cut against the tight storytelling of the previous games. After the previously mentioned missions, and in addition to the side content, Youngblood allows the player to seek out Brother 1, Brother 2, and Brother 3. I entered and fought through Brother 2 first, which turned out to be a mistake because Brother 1 is much shorter and an easier tutorial. Who would have thought? Brother 2, a large military transportation center, was a bit of a slog, but overall it reinforced that the thing that's tempting about this game, the thing that makes it worth playing, is sadly caring less about the world of Wolfenstein and its characters, and more about gunplay and playing with friends, the latter of which is at least defensible. Seeing the cutscenes of Jess and Soph in the elevators reminded me of being in hotel elevators with my brother Joe when we were kids. This is what made the game feel like it was worth it at the time. These 2 sisters set the stage for the player and a friend to have a good time. If you're hanging out and having fun, then it's not a totally awful game. It might not be what the franchise needed, but it's a good time nonetheless. Brother 1, the Gestapo headquarters, had a similar final boss to Brother 2, albeit with more lasers, which was at least neat and required some more running and gunning, but it was definitely short. Afterwards, only Brother 3, a scientific research and development facility, remained. This was my favorite of the 3 levels, with some of the most fun opportunities for stealth, and one of the most dizzying final fights of the 3 installations. Once this effort is over, the twins return to the Paris Catacombs underground resistance cell to celebrate. Of course, Juju and Jacques are secretly Nazis, so they make for poor company. In fact, Jacques is the main antagonist, Lothar. The 2 think they've drugged the protagonist, but we flash back to Abby learning Lothar's identity and guessing at the deception. The 3 are prepared and fight off Lothar and Juju, but Abby is stabbed in the eye as she defends the sisters. This moment comes out of nowhere and hits hard, lingering as Abby goes prone while the twins and Lothar fight. As Lothar and Juju escape, it is undermined ever so slightly when it turns out that Abby, despite losing an eye, is otherwise completely fine. It's hard to describe to someone who hasn't played the game how poorly this moment is handled. 1 second Abby is prone with a knife through her eye, the next she's moving and talking. Did the developers consider killing her off, but just decide against it? Come to think of it, there aren't all too many characters in the majority of this game other than the 2 antagonists and 3 protagonists. It's otherwise narratively barren. If I'm being honest with myself, I can't imagine killing Abby would even make this scene hit harder. There's barely any build-up to this, hardly much investment in the betrayal itself. This isn't how character deaths tend to be handled in the modern Wolfenstein games anyway, so if it happened it probably wouldn't have worked unless the game was structured significantly different. It's a hard realization that death isn't all that meaningful this time around. It's just alternatively an obstacle or tool for the sisters in their fight. The infiltration into Lab X is actually a lot of fun. You can go in guns blazing or do the entire area stealth only. This is Youngblood at its best, with the tightest performing combat and most balanced stealth mechanics. There's so much to love here. But this is our last stop. As we get in deeper, we find the Das Yuhud underground vault over which Lab X is built. The twins thought BJ was being held here against his will, but it's the opposite. He appears to have infiltrated Lab X to try to solve a problem only he knows about. Holding the God Key, BJ explains that Max and Set figured out only too late that the environment of their world is doomed. BJ might have killed Hitler, but in doing so he triggered a deadman switch to destroy the entirety of planet Earth and all human life along with it. In so many more years, he tells us the planet will no longer be fit for human life, but the God Key can open doors to other places and other times. This is the alternative history and science fiction elements of Wolfenstein coming to clash together. In a study of the particular character of Adolf Hitler as contrasted with his contemporary Joseph Stalin, Kershaw writes that, quote, Hitler was irreplaceable in Nazism in a way which did not apply to Stalin and Soviet communism. His position was, in fact, irreconcilable with the setting up of any structures to select a successor. A framework to provide for the succession to Hitler was never established. The frequently mooted party senate never came about. Hitler remained allergic to any conceivable institutional constraint, and by 1943 the deposition of Mussolini by the fascist Grand Council ruled out once and for all any expectation of a party body existing quasi-independently of the leader in Germany. Though Goering had been declared the heir apparent, his succession became increasingly unlikely as the Reich Marshal's star waned visibly during the war. None of the other second-rank Nazi leaders was a serious alternative candidate to succeed Hitler. It is indeed difficult to see who could have taken over, how the personalized rule of Hitler could have become systematized. The regime, one is compelled to suggest, was incapable of reproducing itself. The objection that, but for a lost war, there was nothing to prevent that happening seems misplaced. The war was not accidental to Nazism. It lay at its very core. The war had to be fought and could not be put off until a more favorable juncture. And by the end of 1941, even though the war dragged on a further 3.5 years, the gamble for world power was objectively lost. As such, the dynamism of the regime and its self-destructive essence could be said to have been inseparable." End quote. In a way, the symbolism of a doomsday deadman switch triggering as Hitler dies is a strong choice for Youngblood for this reason. However, it would also appear that the importance of Hitler and the Führer cult to Nazism is why Lothar's subsequent rise to the office of Führer doesn't really hit. On the one hand, from a writing perspective, Lothar has very little presence in the main story of the game, and therefore has very little personality behind what a few quick cutscenes give him. That there can be no Fourth Reich but the end of the world is poetic and striking, but this narrative element isn't channeled into a character-driven conflict in the way that the evils of the Third Reich and Hitlerism were with Death's Head and Engel in particular. I think it speaks to the potential of this narrative, but it's largely squandered potential. I've heard from some critics of this game, and there are many, that the time travel or multiverse element of the plot seemed cliché and generally at odds with the struggle thus far. I'll admit it sticks out a bit in a game that already sticks out from the franchise. I think this was probably the wrong choice, if such a thing can really be said. I recall Noah Caldwell-Gervais specifically speaking on this decision by the writers, and he also seems to have noticed what I did. Set's absence in the absence of his actions is felt starkly in this game. The world where Set slowly undermined the regime by altering the super-concrete recipe to cause mold to steadily grow, eroding the very foundations of Nazism, using Jewish knowledge of the Das Yehud secrets, appears to have suffered no such perceptible erosion. Nazi architecture is as strong as ever, well past the point the results of Set's actions should have been clear. Admittedly, the game looks mainly at France, but even so, one would think there would be something, anything here, to mark that important work. Instead, Set's presence is felt mainly in the suits he designs based on Caroline's, and in the research on the God Key. But Set was a man of God, a member of an order which created such marvelous works of science specifically to become closer to God. Abby is a fine character, but without Set to bring a Jewish presence to the narrative, the closest thing is BJ, and he doesn't mention God much at all. In fact, I don't think he mentions God once. The world of Youngblood has many of the trappings of Wolfenstein. These are the enemies of Wolfenstein, this is the world of Wolfenstein, these are the characters of Wolfenstein, this is even at least sometimes the tone of some of Wolfenstein. But if I may be permitted to say so, this is not the meaning of Wolfenstein. This game has the trappings of Wolfenstein, and it even has what makes Wolfenstein a decent game series, but it does not have what makes it great. What caused games like the New Order and the new Colossus to ascend into deep commentary that would inspire someone to spill this much ink over them, to pick up book after book in search of connections. If every Wolfenstein game was like Youngblood, the greatest indictment I could think to make of it is that I would have wasted my time and yours, and I would be a little embarrassed for having had any faith in myself in this endeavor. In The Old Blood, I mourned Kessler, I empathized with the Golem, I felt a pang of guilt for being unable to save Wesley. I had to physically pause the game and set down the controller when Jay died in the New Order. I cried like a child when Klaus died in Max's arms. In the new Colossus, I burned with rage when Super Spesh was killed, and my heart broke when BJ mourned his mother. But in Youngblood, I feel very little. Melancholy, maybe? There was very little opportunity to be invested in these characters, and in the end, very little was lost. I never got that tragic, painful Wolfenstein moment that I had come to associate with the deep emotions of these games. Mostly, I ran through the Paris streets and burned ammunition and threw hatchets and knives at Nazis. That's alright, but I wanted more. The second great indictment that I can make of this game comes not long after. BJ installs 2 pieces of the God Key into Soph and Jess's armor, and they adventure up while he covers their advance. Lothar is ascending as potential Führer of his new Fourth Reich, and he and Juju are there to meet the twins. Tellingly, he positions Juju in front of him, and she is immediately killed when the twins use their new powers to blast the metal door of the elevator straight into her. Lothar retreats above, and in pursuit the twins engage in an intense battle where the player must use the power of the God Key to catch Lothar's bullets and send them flying back at him. After defeating him in this phase of his fight, the twins fight through more Nazis until they reach the top of Lab X, where the final phases of the boss battle take place. This part of the fight has its own save at the start of Phase 2, where Lothar pilots a jetpack and rains missiles down upon the player. If the player reaches a fail state at any point, they will restart here. After that phase comes another where Lothar chases down the player on foot and fires lasers at them. I had, up until this point, played and eventually beaten all the games on what I figured was the standard normal difficulty setting for the average player. This fight, while brutal enough in the jetpack phase, becomes heinous in the laser phase. Lothar's time to kill the player, even with at least 100 health and 100 armor, is less than a couple seconds, which is bad because in order to be revived, the player's companion must not be downed, so the player naturally needs to revive them, which involves standing still above them for barely a couple seconds. That's about all the time it takes to get down to yourself, however, so I had some grueling fights with Lothar where I burned through the jetpack phase that more than overstayed its welcome, and immediately died in the laser phase. You see, Youngblood doesn't actually regenerate all your ammunition when you respawn at a checkpoint, which is complete bullshit, by the way, and it also doesn't refund more than one of your lives, so if you don't beat the boss on the first try, you're condemned to harder and harder future runs. Eventually, I had enough, and I did the one thing I told myself I would never do in any of these runs. For the first time ever, I turned the difficulty down to the absolute minimum. I wanted out. I wanted to be done. This wasn't rewarding. Seriously, and I am genuinely asking here, who cares about Lothar? The guy is barely a factor prior to the betrayal, and then you only get that one mission after he's shown his true colors. He's barely even a character. Death's Head and Frau Engel, those were some characters. I'm pretty sure Hitler had as much screen time as Lothar in terms of cutscenes, and he wasn't even the main villain of the new Colossus. Even Jaeger or the Golem or random Nazi mini-bosses working under any of the previously mentioned characters earned more of my respect. Naturally, they're all monsters I want nothing more than to lay to rest, but they had some emotional significance. Youngblood doesn't introduce any of that significance with the new emotional feeling, it just borrows it from previous games. So I turned the difficulty down all the way and I blew through the fight. To hell with Lothar. He's a bad mashup of Death's Head and Hitler. Those villains were real characters. What does this guy even want? To be Führer? Newsflash, buddy. Everybody wants to rule the world. Does this guy think he's special? I had to keep going back to my notes to even remember his name. I was over this game. Blissfully, the cavalry arrives and the twins meet up with Abby, Grace, and their parents. They all talk about going off to solve the present situation and leaving the twins in charge of this fight for the time being. After this mild cutscene, another immediately plays. Abby and the twins ponder their future looking to the horizon. They say the rain is coming. It looks like a storm, all right. I just wonder if it means anything. The future of Wolfenstein, both of the games and their setting, is uncertain. Locked within these works of art is, I think, the fundamental question of these kinds of first-person shooter games predicated on fighting Nazis. That question was, and remains, an insecurity of non-Nazi identity, of American identity and every nation beyond. The worst thing a narrative dealing with ideas around Nazism can do is engage in any apologia from whitewashing to outright moral permissiveness. The second worst thing, however, is meaninglessness. The Wolfenstein games are not meaningless, all taken together at least. they're not absent thought, feeling, reflection, introspection, poetic and artistic merit. When these elements operate at their best, they soar. But now the question becomes open-ended. As players wait for a third main Wolfenstein game, along with any tie-ins, that question lingers. How do we walk away from all of this feeling satisfied? Certainly, if we set our expectations at fun gameplay mechanics and strong character writing, we'll feel some satisfaction, but what I mean is, how do we resolve the tension that arises from this narrative? When you set out to engage with ideas around Nazism, the stakes are high, so we come to the end of the story with major questions about what it all means. We can't simply retreat into American or whatever other national identity. I think that's become obvious. The problem with the Nazis wasn't just that they were Germans, after all. It was how they saw the world and where Nazism leads. In Shakespeare's Macbeth, when he learns that his wife is dead, Macbeth says, quote, "She should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player, that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." It's very postmodern of Shakespeare to have Macbeth call life itself a player on the stage who lives but briefly, when of course Macbeth is a character in a play himself who dies by the end of the play. But that comparison has itself become a popular idiom in our culture to describe the apparent meaninglessness of life. Where does Nazism lead? Where does Nazism lead? Whether life is meaningless to you or not, we cannot deny its causality. Macbeth's petty pace from day to day is something I think about often. To my eyes, life is not a player on a stage, rather, history is a railroad. Where it leads, who can say? You get on and you get off at your stop. But we should have a say in where it's going. Maybe this metaphor appeals more to me because resonant metaphors for human life of my time include things like the film and later television series Snowpiercer, where society is all aboard a single train. But Macbeth's outburst is the failing derangement of a murderous tyrant lashing out at the cruelty of fate. He doesn't understand his loss, and he doesn't have long left to learn. But maybe we still have time. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, we may yet have time. Time to understand, time to grow, time to change. What is most frustrating of all is the apparent inevitability of everything. Only in stories do events occur, but history develops. All historical events redound to further and further material causes, which might lead one to think that perhaps but for a few alternatives, things couldn't have happened much differently. This is what makes speculative alternative history and fiction so fantastical. In this way, praying and hoping for change may also seem fantastical. If things happened the way they did for a very important reason, how can the railroad lead anywhere but Auschwitz? That is the line of thinking of someone who rationalizes the past, anyway. But just as society limits what we are able to know and where we are able to go, the unseen beyond those limitations is the product of seeking answers against the grain of that prescription. There are many ways of thinking in this society that have prevented us from asking important questions, not merely because of what we believe or why, but also because of the manner in which we believe it. Blaskowitz has his God key to write the past, to make the future possible, but we, my friends, have precious time. Time we require to understand. If we use it wisely, then perhaps we can finally say that never again will we submit to the tyrannies of the past or the present.